From a distance, the cottage looked peaceful. Its walls were made from rough timber darkened by years of rain and smoke. A narrow stone chimney rose above the roof, releasing a thin gray ribbon into the cold morning air. Beside the doorway, split logs were stacked beneath a simple wooden shelter. A small garden rested behind the house, now mostly empty after the autumn harvest. To a modern observer, the scene might have appeared warm, charming, and comfortably removed from the noise of the world. But inside an American cottage in the early 19th century, comfort was never guaranteed. Before sunrise, while darkness still covered the surrounding fields, the household was already beginning to move. The family living here consisted of Samuel Turner, his wife Martha, their 3 children, and Samuel's widowed mother. 6 people shared 2 small rooms. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, workplace, and gathering place. The second room contained several straw-filled mattresses, separated by little more than hanging cloth. There was no private bedroom for the parents, no nursery for the youngest child, and no quiet corner where someone could retreat. The first person awake was usually Martha. She rose carefully from the mattress, trying not to disturb the children sleeping nearby. The air inside the cottage was almost as cold as the air outside. During the night, the fire had burned low, leaving only a few red embers beneath a layer of ash. Without that fire, there would be no hot breakfast, no warm water, and no protection against the morning cold. Maintaining the hearth was one of the most important responsibilities in the home. Matches were not yet common household objects, and starting a new fire could require a flint, steel, dry cloth, and patience. For that reason, families tried to keep embers alive through the night. If the fire went completely out, someone might have to borrow burning coals from a neighbor, assuming the nearest neighbor lived close enough to reach. Martha knelt beside the hearth and gently stirred the ashes. She added dry twigs, then thin pieces of wood. For several minutes, nothing happened. Smoke rose into her face, causing her eyes to water. Finally, a small flame appeared. Smoke was a constant presence inside cottages like this one. Chimneys often drew poorly, especially during damp weather or strong winds, so collected on walls, cooking pots, clothing, and lungs. Even when the fire worked properly, the room could smell of burned wood, grease, wet wool, and human bodies. Once the flame grew stronger, Martha placed an iron pot above it. The breakfast would be cornmeal mush, prepared with water and a small amount of milk. It was filling, inexpensive, and familiar. Meat was saved for special meals or for days when Samuel needed extra strength for heavy work. While the food cooked, Martha pulled on a wool shawl and stepped outside to collect water. There was no faucet in the cottage. Every drop used for cooking, drinking, cleaning, or washing had to be carried by hand. The family's well stood several hundred feet from the house. During dry months, the water level dropped. During heavy rain, mud surrounded the path. In winter, ice could form around the stones, making each trip dangerous. Martha lowered the bucket, waited for it to fill, and then pulled it upward using a rope worn smooth by years of use. A full bucket was heavy. By the time she returned to the cottage, water had splashed across her skirt and soaked the edge of her shoes. This journey would be repeated several times before the day ended. Inside, Samuel was now awake. He dressed quickly in trousers, a linen shirt, and a thick coat repaired to the elbows. Clothing was expensive, so garments were rarely discarded. They were patched repeatedly, passed from older children to younger ones, and sometimes cut apart to make smaller items. Samuel's work changed with the season. During planting and harvest, he labored in nearby fields. At other times, he repaired fences, cut timber, cared for animals, or accepted temporary work from wealthier landowners. A single injury could threaten the survival of the entire household. There was no insurance, no paid leave, and no reliable government assistance. If Samuel could not work, the family's food supply could disappear within weeks. The children began waking as the smell of breakfast filled the room. 12-year-old Thomas was expected to help his father with outdoor work. 9-year-old Eliza assisted her mother with cooking, sewing, and caring for her younger brother. 5-year-old William had fewer formal responsibilities, But childhood in the cottage was brief. Even small children collected kindling, carried vegetables, watched chickens, and learned not to waste food. Breakfast was eaten from simple wooden bowls around a narrow table. Conversation was limited. Everyone understood that daylight was valuable. After eating, Samuel and Thomas stepped outside to split wood. The sound of the axe echoed through the cold air. Firewood was essential not only for warmth, but also for every cooked meal, every heated bath, and every pot of boiled water. A household could burn several cords of wood during a difficult winter. Gathering, it demanded days of cutting, hauling, stacking, and protecting it from rain. Inside, Martha began the work of cleaning the cottage. Modern images often show 19th century homes as spotless spaces filled with polished furniture and glowing candles. The reality was much different. Dirt entered through gaps beneath the door. Ash fell from the hearth. Mice found their way into food storage. Fleas and lice could hide in bedding. Flies gathered around milk, meat, and waste. The cottage floor was made from rough wooden boards. In poorer homes, it might have been packed earth. Sweeping removed visible dirt, but it did little to eliminate insects or disease. Soap was available, but it was often homemade from animal fat and lye. Producing it was unpleasant and sometimes dangerous. Because soap required time and valuable materials, it was used carefully. Bathing the entire body was uncommon, especially during cold weather. Heating enough water required large amounts of wood and many trips to the well. Instead, family members often washed their hands, faces, and exposed skin using a basin. Clothing was washed less frequently than modern people would consider acceptable, partly because the labor was exhausting and partly because drying heavy garments during winter could take days. By mid-morning, the cottage was warmer, but the work had barely begun. Martha kneaded bread dough while Eliza cleaned vegetables from storage. Apples hung from the rafters to keep them away from rodents. Onions and herbs dried near the wall. Barrels contained flour, cornmeal, salted meat, and whatever remained from the harvest. The food supply appeared substantial, but every item had to last. A family could not simply visit a grocery store when something ran out. The nearest town might be miles away, and purchases required cash that rural families rarely possessed in large amounts. Food had to be carefully measured. A spoiled barrel of grain, a broken jar of preserves, or a hungry animal entering the storage area could create a serious crisis. That afternoon, Martha noticed dark marks beneath one of the sacks of cornmeal. She moved the sack and discovered small holes near the bottom. Mice had found the family's winter food. The loss appeared minor at first, but the coldest months had not yet arrived. Every handful of grain mattered. As Samuel examined the damage, he understood that the cottage's warm walls offered only an illusion of security. Outside, the wind was beginning to rise. The roof creaked above them, and somewhere near the chimney, a faint drop of water struck the floor. Winter was approaching, and the cottage was already beginning to fail. By the first week of December, the cottage no longer looked peaceful. Snow had gathered along the edge of the roof, covering the damaged shingles that Samuel had been unable to replace before the weather changed. The garden had disappeared beneath a hard white surface. The path to the well was frozen and uneven, and the surrounding field stood silent under a gray winter sky. Inside, the Turner family had entered the most dangerous season of the year. The leaking roof had worsened during a night of freezing rain. Water slipped through a narrow opening near the chimney, ran along a ceiling beam, and fell steadily into a wooden bowl placed on the floor. Samuel had climbed onto the roof 2 days earlier and attempted a temporary repair using scraps of wood, cloth, and pine tar. The work had slowed the leak, but it had not stopped it. Repairing a cottage in winter was difficult and sometimes impossible. Materials cost money. Frozen would split unpredictably, and ladders became dangerous when covered with ice. A serious fall could destroy a family more quickly than a damaged roof. The cold entered from every direction. Wind passed through spaces between the wall boards. Frost formed on the inside of the windows during the night. Cloth had been pushed into cracks near the floor, and an old blanket hung across the doorway. But these measures offered only limited protection. The hearth remained the center of the family's survival. Samuel and Thomas carried firewood inside several times each day. The woodpile had seemed large in autumn, but it now appeared to shrink with frightening speed. A severe winter could consume more fuel than a family expected. If the supply ran low, Samuel would have to cut additional timber in deep snow, when exhaustion and injury were constant risks. Everyone stayed close to the fire, though the heat rarely reached the far corners of the room. Those seated nearest the flames felt their faces grow hot, while their backs remained cold. The sparks occasionally escaped onto the floor. Clothing hanging nearby could catch fire, and young children had to be watched carefully. William, the youngest child, had developed a cough. At first, it appeared mild. He coughed during breakfast, then again while sitting near the hearth. Martha gave him warm water mixed with honey, one of the few comforting remedies available to her. By evening, however, his cheeks had become unusually red, and his breathing sounded heavier. Illness inside a 19th century cottage was never a private event. There was little space to separate the sick from the healthy. Family members slept close together, shared utensils, and breathed the same smoky air. A cough could pass quickly from one person to another. Medical assistance was uncertain. A physician might live several miles away, and his visit could cost more than the family could easily pay. Even when a doctor arrived, medical knowledge remained limited. Many treatments were ineffective, and some were dangerous. Martha stayed beside William through the night. She placed a damp cloth across his forehead and listened to every breath. The cottage creaked under the winter wind. Samuel slept lightly nearby, aware that he might need to ride for help before dawn. By morning, William's fever had not broken. Samuel wrapped himself in his coat and prepared the horse. The road to the nearest village had nearly vanished beneath the snow, but waiting carried its own danger. "Keep him close to the fire," Samuel told Martha. "I will. If his breathing worsens, send Thomas after me." Martha looked toward the small window. Snow was already falling again. "Be careful on the road." Samuel nodded, but both understood that caution could not control the weather. He left before sunrise. The journey that normally required less than an hour took nearly twice as long. Snow filled the ruts in the road, and ice covered the wooden bridge across the creek. Samuel guided the horse slowly, knowing that a broken leg, his own or the animal's, would leave the family without its strongest worker and most valuable means of transportation. Back at the cottage, Martha continued her ordinary tasks because illness did not stop the needs of the household. The fire required wood. Water had to be carried. Food had to be prepared. Bedding needed to be shaken, though the cold made opening the door unbearable. The older children still needed to eat, and the animals outside still needed care. Eliza watched the pot of oatmeal while Martha sat beside William. "Is he going to die?" the girl asked quietly. Martha looked at her daughter. Children in the 19th century were familiar with death in a way that many modern children were not. They saw sick siblings disappear, mothers die in childbirth, and neighbors buried after sudden fevers or accidents. "He is sick," Martha said, "but we're doing everything we can." It was an honest answer, though not a comforting one. The physician arrived in the afternoon. Dr. Harris was an older man with a worn leather bag and a heavy wool coat. He examined William's throat, listened to his chest, and asked how long the fever had lasted. He could not identify the exact cause with certainty. He recommended rest, warmth, fluids, and a preparation from his bag intended to ease the cough. His visit cost money that Samuel did not have. Instead, Samuel promised payment after spring planting. Such arrangements were common in rural communities, where cash was scarce and debts were carried through seasons. A physician might accept grain, labor, firewood, or livestock instead of coins. The doctor left before dark, hoping to reach the village before the road froze again. William survived the night, but the family's troubles continued. Several days later, Samuel discovered that moisture from the leaking roof had reached part of the grain storage. A corner of one sack smelled sour. Another contained gray patches of mold. The damaged portion had to be thrown away. Martha hated wasting food, but spoiled grain could make the entire family sick. She spread the remaining cornmeal across a clean cloth near the hearth, trying to dry it without burning it. The family supply was now smaller than expected, and winter had only begun. Meals became thinner. Cornmeal mush contained more water. Bread was baked less often. Salted pork was cut into smaller pieces and used mainly to flavor beans or cabbage. Martha saved every scrap of fat for cooking, candle making, or soap. Nothing was considered disposable. Bones were boiled for broth. Worn fabric became patches, rags, or stuffing. Ashes from the fireplace were collected for soap making. Even feathers from slaughtered chickens could be saved for bedding. Yet thrift could not solve every problem. By January, the woodpile had dropped below half its original size. Samuel began spending long mornings in the forest, cutting fallen branches and dragging logs through the snow. Thomas accompanied him despite the cold. The boy was only 12, but he worked beside his father like a young man. His hands cracked from the weather. His boots, once belonging to Samuel, were slightly too large and had been repaired with strips of leather. Snow entered through the seams, leaving his socks wet by midday. Wet clothing was dangerous in freezing temperatures. Returning to the cottage, Thomas stood near the fire while Martha removed his socks and rubbed his feet to restore warmth. There was no guarantee that the boots would survive until spring. The family's isolation deepened as the snow accumulated. Neighbors who lived only a few miles away became difficult to reach. News traveled slowly. A family could experience illness, injury, or hunger without anyone knowing for days. The Turners relied on each other because they had no alternative. One evening, while Samuel was outside securing the animal shed, a violent gust struck the cottage. The roof groaned. A section of the wooden shutter tore loose and slammed repeatedly against the outer wall. Thomas moved toward the door. "Stay inside," Martha ordered. "But Father may need help." Before she could answer, the door opened and Samuel entered, covered in snow. "The shed is holding," he said, breathing heavily. "But we may lose part of the roof if this continues." The family listened as the storm intensified. The candle flame bent each time wind entered through the walls. William, still recovering, began to cry. Eliza wrapped a blanket around him. Samuel positioned a table beneath the weakest ceiling beam and used a long piece of timber to support it. There was little else he could do. The family sat together beside the hearth, fully dressed beneath their blankets. No one slept. The roof shook above them as though the entire cottage might be pulled apart. For hours they waited. Near dawn, the wind weakened. The cottage remained standing, but daylight revealed new damage. Several shingles were missing. Snow had entered the attic space. Part of the interior wall was damp, and the stored firewood near the doorway had been covered by drifting snow. They had survived the storm, but survival came at a cost. Samuel looked around the room, the wet wall, the emptying shelves, the tired faces of his children. The cottage was still their shelter, but it was also a structure that demanded constant labor, money, and sacrifice. There was no landlord to call, no repair company to summon, and no emergency fund waiting in a bank. Every weakness in the house became the family's responsibility. And beyond the walls, winter still had many weeks remaining. By late February, winter had begun to weaken, but the Turner family did not feel relieved. The snow around the cottage slowly collapsed into gray piles. Water dripped from the damaged roof, collected beneath the eaves, and turned the yard into deep mud. The path to the well was no longer frozen, but every step sank into the soft ground. The warmer days brought light through the windows, revealing soot on the walls, stains across the ceiling, and dust that had remained hidden during the darkest months. Spring was approaching, but it did not erase what winter had taken. The family supply of grain was nearly exhausted. The salted pork barrel held only a few small pieces. Several potatoes stored beneath the floor had softened or begun to rot. The firewood pile had been reduced to scattered logs and damp branches. William's fever was gone, yet his cough remained. He tired easily and often sat beside the doorway watching the others work. Martha worried that the illness had weakened him permanently, but there was no way to know. Rural families frequently lived with uncertainty after sickness. A child might recover completely, or the effects might continue for months. There were no medical examinations to provide reassurance. There were only observations made by candlelight, whispered conversations between parents, and the hope that warmer weather would restore strength. Samuel also carried the consequences of winter. During one of his final trips to cut wood, he had injured his right shoulder while dragging a fallen branch across the snow. At first, he ignored the pain. Rest was a luxury the family could not afford. He continued lifting buckets, repairing the roof, and caring for the animals. By spring, the injury had not healed. Each morning, he struggled to raise his arm above his head. Planting season was approaching, and the family's future depended on his ability to work the soil. The cottage had survived the storm, but much of the roof required replacement. The chimney stones had shifted slightly, allowing more smoke into the main room. Dampness had entered one wall, and Martha noticed dark patches spreading near the floor. Moisture was one of the silent dangers of 19th century homes. Without modern foundations, drainage systems, or insulation, cottages absorbed water from rain, snow, and wet ground. Damp walls encouraged mold. Wooden beams rotted. Bedding developed a sour smell. Insects returned as the temperature rose. The Turners opened the door whenever weather allowed, trying to dry the interior. Rugs and blankets were carried outside and beaten with sticks. Mattresses were emptied, and the straw inside was examined for fleas and moisture. Replacing the straw required fresh material, which would not be available until later in the year. For now, Martha removed the worst portions and spread what remained beneath the sun. Spring cleaning was not simply a matter of appearance. It was an attempt to reduce illness, insects, and decay after months of confinement. The work demanded nearly everyone's participation. Eliza scrubbed the table and wooden bowls with hot water and homemade soap. Thomas carried ashes from the hearth and scattered them where the yard remained slippery. Samuel inspected the roof from the ground, unwilling to admit that his shoulder might prevent him from climbing safely. Martha washed clothing beside a large tub. Laundry was among the most exhausting domestic tasks of the century. Water had to be carried and heated. Clothing was soaked, scrubbed, boiled, rinsed, wrung out, and hung to dry. Heavy wool garments absorbed large amounts of water, making them difficult to lift. The soap irritated Martha's hands, which were already cracked from winter. By midday, her back ached, but there were still blankets to clean and food to prepare. For women living in cottages like this one, household labor had no clear beginning or end. Cooking, washing, sewing, nursing, preserving food, carrying water, and caring for children formed a continuous cycle. Much of this work was unpaid and rarely recorded in official histories, yet the survival of the household depended upon it. The romantic image of the 19th century cottage often centers on the hearth, the garden, and the handmade meal. It rarely includes the woman kneeling beside a tub with bleeding hands or waking several times during the night to care for a sick child. Samuel's situation was equally uncertain. He traveled to a neighboring farm to ask for temporary work and returned with discouraging news. The landowner needed laborers, but the work involved lifting stones and repairing fences. Samuel's injured shoulder made him slower than the other men. He was offered fewer days and lower pay. The family also owed Dr. Harris for William's visit. Payment had been delayed until spring, but the debt had not disappeared. Samuel offered to deliver firewood, though his own household barely had enough remaining. Debt in rural communities was rarely written on formal documents. It existed through promises, favors, exchanged labor, and personal reputation. A family that failed to meet its obligations could lose access to future assistance. Samuel understood that one unpaid debt might lead to another. For several evenings, he and Martha discussed what could be sold. The cow provided milk and was too valuable to lose. The horse was necessary for transportation and fieldwork. Their few tools were essential. Furniture had little value, and clothing could not easily be replaced. Finally, They decided to sell 2 chickens and a hand-woven blanket Martha had made before William's birth. The blanket had required weeks of labor. It had kept the children warm during several winters. Selling it brought less money than Martha had hoped, but enough to pay part of the doctor's fee and purchase nails for the roof. Nothing in the cottage was merely decorative. Every object represented work, security, or memory. Selling one often meant surrendering part of the family's protection against future hardship. In March, the ground finally softened enough for planting. Samuel and Thomas entered the field before sunrise. Thomas handled much of the heavier work, though he was only 12. He guided the horse while his father controlled the plow with his stronger arm. The soil resisted them. Winter moisture had left some areas thick and heavy. Each step pulled at their boots. Samuel's shoulder burned whenever the plow struck a stone. Still, they continued. A failed planting would mean hunger months later. Every row had to be completed, regardless of pain. Inside the cottage, Martha and Eliza prepared seeds for the garden. Cabbage, beans, onions, squash, and medicinal herbs would be planted in small sections behind the house. The garden was not a hobby. It was part of the family's food supply. Children learned early that nature could not be controlled. Too much rain could drown seedlings. Too little could destroy them. Insects could consume leaves overnight. Animals could enter through a damaged fence. A family might work from spring until autumn and still produce less than it needed. One morning, Martha found Eliza standing near the empty chicken enclosure. A fox had entered during the night. Feathers were scattered across the ground, and one of the remaining hens was gone. Eliza blamed herself. She had been responsible for securing the enclosure before dark. "I thought the latch was closed," she said, fighting tears. Martha examined the broken fastening. "It was worn," she replied. "This was not only your fault, but we needed that chicken." "Yes," Martha said quietly. "We did." There was no way to soften the truth. The loss of a single animal mattered. Together, they repaired the latch using wire and a bent nail. Eliza worked silently, understanding that mistakes inside the cottage had consequences far greater than a scolding. As the season advanced, William began to regain his strength. He followed Thomas into the yard and collected small pieces of wood. His cough appeared less often. Martha watched him carefully, but allowed herself a small measure of hope. The roof was repaired in stages. Samuel traded 3 days of labor for additional shingles. A neighbor helped replace the most damaged section, and Thomas climbed beside him. The new pieces did not match the old ones, but they kept out most of the rain. This cooperation was one of the few forms of security available to families like the Turners. Neighbors exchanged labor during planting, harvest, childbirth, illness, and construction. They lent tools, shared food, carried messages, and helped bury the dead. Such support was not always generous or without expectation. A favor received often created a future obligation. Still, without community assistance, many households could not have survived. By May, the cottage once again appeared inviting from the road. Wild flowers grew beside the fence. Smoke rose gently from the chimney. Clean blankets moved in the breeze, and the garden showed its first rows of green. A traveler passing by might have imagined a peaceful life inside. He would not have seen the debt owed to the physician, Samuel's injured shoulder, Martha's damaged hands, or the grain lost to mice and moisture. He would not have known about the nights spent listening to the roof shake, or the fear surrounding William's fever. He would have seen only the cottage. That illusion has survived into the modern world. Images of 19th century cottages often present a life of simplicity. Bread warming near the fire, children gathered around a table, and families protected from the pressures of industrial society. But simplicity did not mean ease. The absence of modern technology required constant physical labor. The absence of medical care made ordinary illnesses dangerous. The absence of financial protection turned a small accident into a household crisis. Warmth, food, cleanliness, and shelter had to be created each day through effort that never fully ended. Yet the Turner family story was not defined only by suffering. They had survived because every person contributed. Thomas accepted adult responsibilities before adulthood. Eliza learned difficult household work beside her mother. Martha held the family together through illness, scarcity, and exhaustion. Samuel continued working despite pain and uncertainty. Their strength did not come from living an easier or more natural life. It came from adapting to conditions they could not escape. One evening, as spring sunlight entered through the doorway, the family sat around the narrow table. Their meal consisted of bread, thin soup, and the first fresh greens from the garden. It was not a feast, but after the winter they had endured, the taste of fresh food felt almost extraordinary. Samuel looked at the repaired ceiling. Martha watched William finish his bowl. Thomas spoke about the progress in the field, while Eliza described the beans beginning to rise from the soil. For a few minutes, the cottage felt peaceful. The family understood that other hardships would come. There would be more storms, illnesses, failed harvests, debts, and repairs. The walls would continue to demand attention, and the land would never guarantee a reward for their labor. But on that spring evening, the roof was dry, the fire was burning, and everyone was alive. For families living in 19th century cottages, that was often the closest thing to comfort they could expect.